Welcome to our next instalment on the Book of Joy and the 8 pillars of joy. For the last 4 weeks, we've been looking at the 4 pillars of the mind: perspective, humility, humour, and acceptance. And the pillars of the mind, and the sort of meditation that the Dalai Lama does is called analytical meditation, where he really rationally challenges and tests some of the thoughts and experiences that he has. So the pillars of the mind are the ones where we can really start to think about what we're thinking. Is it real? Can we get perspective on it? Are we thinking too much of ourselves or too little? Are we able to laugh at ourselves? And that idea of accepting reality as it is. Many people are just deeply unhappy that reality is what it is and long to change it. I suppose a lot of this is about how we change ourselves. So we're moving from the pillars of the mind to the 4 pillars of the heart. And the first one is that huge one, forgiveness. The Book of Joy, obviously with the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu, you would expect there's many stories about forgiveness in here, from the South African Truth and Reconciliation Committee to some of the issues around the Dalai Lama, Tibet and China. So they're all big issues. One philosopher said that the only forgiveness worth really exploring is forgiving the unforgivable, which does make us really think about forgiveness in terms of some of those big issues, big terms. A lot of really interesting theology on forgiveness has also emerged from major crimes in the world. We obviously have the Holocaust, but there's also been some really deep and interesting stuff that has emerged from the likes of Bosnia and obviously South Africa as well. Deep issues that really challenge what forgiveness means. In terms of the Christian faith and tradition, we obviously say it every Sunday in our Lord's Prayer. Forgive our debts as we forgive our debtors. So it's there. Forgiveness, a huge part of the Christian tradition and many other religions, trips off the tongue very easily and is really difficult to do. In the book, there's a couple of accounts and stories which really struck me. And they weren't the big ones around the Truth and Reconciliation Committee or the Dalai Lama and China. One of them, Desmond Tutu, talks about someone saying about Nelson Mandela's 27 years in prison and what a waste that was. And the Archbishop Tutu says it wasn't a waste. It needed 27 years incarceration for Nelson Mandela to emerge as the man he did and to allow that peaceful transition to a new South Africa. I think that shocked a lot of people, the way Tutu expressed that, but it also gives that idea about forgiveness is really, really tough. We often think forgiveness has a certain natural occurrence. Someone does something bad, they come with an apology, we accept the apology, and we forgive. A lot of the Christian tradition is saying that the apology is not required for the forgiveness to happen. So that sort of challenges that almost exchange idea. Only once they've apologised, only once there's repentance, will we give forgiveness. And one of the theologians around forgiveness plays around a little bit with the word forgiving, it's giving before we require an apology. Desmond Tutu, as you can imagine, has done a lot of work around forgiveness, and he talks about forgiveness can also be seen as a very liberating tool for the person who the wrong has been done to. So he says that without forgiveness, that person will remain shackled to the perpetrator. They will be chained to the perpetrator, and the perpetrator will always have the keys to that chain unless they can forgive them, and that forgiveness frees them from that person and from that action. So in some ways it's about letting go of the past. It is not, as the saying goes, forgive and forget. It's not about forgetting. People will still remember what has happened to them, and that becomes part of their story. So it's not about forgetting. Some people say it's about remembering in a different way, where we're not, as it were, chained to that story of our past. So it's not about forgetting, and it's not about giving up your claim for justice. So in forgiving, you're not saying that's it, there's no justice claims there. And I think the Truth and Reconciliation Committee's done, they did so much of that stuff in trying to separate out amnesties and claims for justice and everything else in there. So a really difficult thing. Jesus was challenged many times by the Pharisees for offering forgiveness. Who does this man think he is? Does he think he's God, that he can forgive? So forgiveness comes through Jesus' story an awful lot too. I think it's quite revealing though that on the cross Jesus says, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. So maybe there are certain things which are just too hard for us to forgive, and a way that we can still seek that forgiveness is in maybe praying to God to forgive them, which is a wee bit of a step away. Forgiveness is tough. It is really tough. It's not about forgetting. It's not about giving up your claims for justice. It is about some form of release from the past, about remembering in a different way, not being chained to that event and that perpetrator. And it's also in many ways about exploring our own roles within that. We need to offer and to give forgiveness. Almost all, it's not I'm always in the right, therefore other people need to forgive me. It is forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. We need to keep looking at the things we require forgiveness of. And in many ways, the hardest person to forgive is often ourselves. The other story in the book that really jumped out and hit me was Douglas Abrams, who really pulls the book together, challenged Desmond Tutu about the time when he and his wife Leah and their family were in London, and he was studying there and working there. In London, they were equal before the law. They had access to work and education, and that was the time when Tutu decided he had to return to South Africa. He had to be part of the apartheid struggle, and of course that meant going back to a very different world than the one they had experienced in London. The apartheid regime had set up a different schooling system for blacks, so Tutu decided that his children would study in neighbouring Swaziland. So that meant boarding, so that meant splitting the family up. And Douglas challenged him and says, did you ask for forgiveness from your wife Leah about taking the family back to South Africa at that time? And he says the righteousness of the cause, and it was all, it was something he needed to do. And Douglas says you could see him sinking a little bit into himself, taking that pause, closing his eyes, having a think, and he could have either gone to argue his case even more aggressively, or he could actually look at whether he needed forgiveness. And it was the latter that he took. And Douglas says about 2 weeks later he got a letter from Desmond Tutu once they'd all returned from this meeting with the Dalai Lama. And he says, I went home and I asked Leah for her forgiveness for that time. And she said, I'd forgiven you a long time ago. But Douglas says it was really good to see that someone of Tutu's standing and that relationship that had stood so many hardships still required and still needed that constant giving and receiving of forgiveness. Tough subject. And we do have a meditation, and this comes from Desmond Tutu, The Fourfold Path of Forgiveness. And again, it developed over Desmond Tutu's role as chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, looking at forgiveness and reconciliation as well. The Tutu and his daughter produced a book, the Book of Forgiving, and there is now a global forgiveness challenge. It's been used by people from over 170 countries. And what we're going to look at here is the basic steps in the fourfold path. So let's start. Step 1 is telling your story. All forgiveness must begin by facing the truth. You can write down in a journal or tell a trusted friend what happened. Telling your story also allows you to integrate the memories in your consciousness and diffuse some of the emotional reactivity. To help heal the memories and avoid re-traumatizing yourself, it's helpful to imagine that you are watching the event happening in a movie. This way you may reduce the chances of triggering the brain's neural stress response. In one scientific protocol by Ethan Kross and his colleagues suggests recalling your experience this way. Close your eyes. Go back to the time and place of the emotional experience and see the scene in your mind's eye. Now take a few steps back. Move away from the situation to a point where you can watch the event unfold from a distance and see yourself in the event, the distant you. Watch the experience unfold as if it were happening to the distant you all over again. Observe the distant self. Step 2. Naming the hurt. The facts are the facts, but these experiences cause strong emotions and pain, which are important to name. So as you watch the situation unfold around the distant self, try to understand his or her feelings. Why did he or she have those feelings? What were the causes and reasons for the feelings? If the hurt is fresh, ask yourself, will this situation affect me in 10 years' time. If the hurt is old, ask yourself whether you want to continue to carry this pain or whether you want to free yourself from this pain and suffering. Step 3. Granting forgiveness. The ability to forgive comes from the recognition of our shared humanity and the acknowledgement that, inevitably, because we are human, we hurt and are hurt by one another. Can you accept the humanity of the person who hurt you and the fact that they likely hurt you out of their own suffering? If you can accept your shared humanity, then you can release your presumed right to revenge and can move towards healing rather than retaliation. We also recognise that, especially between intimates, there can be multiple hurts, and we often need to forgive and ask for forgiveness at the same time, accepting our part in the human drama. And step 4, renewing or releasing the relationship. Once you have forgiven someone, you must make the important decision of whether you want to renew the relationship or release it. If the trauma is significant, there is no going back to the relationship you had before, but there is the opportunity of a new relationship. When we renew relationships, we can benefit from healing our family or community. And when we release the relationship, we can move on, especially if we can truly wish the best for the person who has harmed us and recognise that they, like us, simply want to avoid suffering and be happy in their life. A fourfold path of forgiveness. And hopefully you can see how our pillars of the mind sort of run through this as well. The idea of perspective, stepping back, distancing yourself from the event, but watching it almost like an observer. The humility of each one of us. Humour maybe doesn't come into this one so much, but acceptance as well. The facts are the facts. Name the hurt, which is always a very difficult thing, but a very healing thing to do as well. Step 5, and the first of the 4 pillars of the heart, forgiveness. And we'll join you next week for another pillar of the heart. Take care. God bless.